In the summer of 1887, a wealthy oil tycoon from Boston rode into the dusty town of Silver Creek, Arizona, with a proposition that would test the limits of one man's love, honor, and the very meaning of what it meant to protect the woman he cherished. What happened next became a legend whispered around campfires for generations, a tale of a small rancher who stood against the most powerful men in the territory, armed with nothing but his courage and the fierce love of a woman who towered above every person in that frontier town. This is the true story of Samuel Cole and his remarkable wife, Running Deer, and the night that changed everything they knew about strength, dignity, and the price of standing tall in a world that wanted them to kneel. Samuel Cole had never been a man who sought trouble. He was 32 years old in that fateful summer, with sun-weathered skin the color of saddle leather and hands that told the story of a lifetime spent working the unforgiving land of the Arizona Territory. His ranch sat 12 miles outside of Silver Creek, a modest spread of 300 acres where he raised cattle and horses with the kind of quiet dedication that earned respect, but never wealth. He had come to Arizona from Missouri when he was just 19 years old, running from a past that held nothing but empty promises and broken dreams. His father had been a drunk who lost the family farm to gambling debts, and his mother had died of consumption when Samuel was just 15 years old. There was nothing left for him in Missouri, so he headed west like so many young men of his generation, seeking a new life in a land that promised freedom to those brave enough to claim it. The first years had been hard beyond anything Samuel could have imagined. He worked as a cowhand on various ranches, sleeping under the stars more nights than he could count, eating beans and hardtack until he forgot what a proper meal tasted like. He saved every penny he earned, living on almost nothing, dreaming of the day when he would have his own piece of land. That dream finally came true when he was 26 years old. He purchased his ranch from an old Mexican rancher named Esteban Morales, who was too sick to work the land anymore. The price was fair, and Esteban even stayed on for a few months to teach Samuel the particular challenges of ranching in the Arizona desert. When the old man finally passed away peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, Samuel buried him on a hillside overlooking the property, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. For 3 years, Samuel worked that land alone. He was not a lonely man by nature, but there were times when the silence of the desert nights pressed down on him like a physical weight. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, and wonder if this was all his life would ever be. He was not unhappy, exactly, but there was an emptiness inside him that all his hard work could not fill. Everything changed on a spring morning in 1884, 3 years before the events that would make him a legend. Samuel had ridden into Silver Creek to purchase supplies and pick up his mail from the general store. The town was busier than usual that day, and there was a strange tension in the air that he could not quite identify. People were gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices and casting worried glances toward the edge of town. He asked the store owner, a friendly German immigrant named Heinrich Mueller, what all the commotion was about. Heinrich's face grew serious. He told Samuel that a group of Apache had been spotted in the hills about 5 miles from town. The army had been chasing them for weeks, and now they were trapped with nowhere to go. Most of the townspeople were afraid there would be trouble. Samuel nodded and went about his business. He had no particular feelings about the Apache one way or another. He knew that the relationship between the settlers and the native tribes was complicated and often bloody, but he had never personally had any conflict with them. He preferred to mind his own business and let others do the same. It was on his way back to the ranch that afternoon when everything changed. He was riding along the creek that gave the town its name when he heard a sound that made him pull his horse to a sudden stop. It was a cry of pain, coming from somewhere in the thick brush along the water's edge. Samuel sat very still in his saddle, listening. The sound came again, and this time he could tell it was a woman's voice. He dismounted and tied his horse to a tree, then made his way carefully through the brush toward the source of the sound. What he found there would alter the course of his entire life. She was lying on the ground beside the creek, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Even in her injured state, the first thing Samuel noticed about her was her size. She was the largest woman he had ever seen in his life, taller than any man he had ever met, and built with the kind of solid strength that spoke of a lifetime of hard physical work. Her black hair was matted with dirt and dried blood, and her face was bruised and swollen. She wore the traditional dress of an Apache woman, though it was torn and stained from what must have been days of running and hiding. When she saw Samuel approach, her dark eyes widened with fear, and she tried to drag herself away from him, gasping in pain as her broken legs scraped against the ground. Samuel stopped where he was and held up his hands to show they were empty. He spoke to her in a calm, gentle voice, telling her that he meant her no harm, that he only wanted to help her. He did not know if she understood English, but he hoped that the tone of his voice would communicate what his words might not. For a long moment, she stared at him with those fierce dark eyes, and Samuel felt as though she was looking straight into his soul, measuring him against some standard that he could not comprehend. Then, something in her expression shifted, and she lowered her head slightly in what might have been a nod of acceptance. Samuel moved slowly toward her, being careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten her. When he finally reached her side and got a closer look at her injuries, his heart sank. Her leg was badly broken, probably from a fall down the rocky hillside that bordered the creek. She had other injuries too, cuts and bruises that suggested she had been running for a very long time. He knew that if he left her here, she would die. The army patrols would find her, or she would simply waste away from her injuries and lack of food and water. He also knew that if he helped her, he would be putting himself at considerable risk. The people of Silver Creek did not look kindly on anyone who aided the Apache, and the army would have questions for him if they ever found out. But Samuel Cole was not a man who could leave a suffering creature to die alone in the brush. He had never been that kind of person, and he was not about to start now. He told her that he was going to carry her to his horse and take her to his ranch where he could tend to her injuries. He did not know if she understood, but when he carefully lifted her into his arms, she did not fight him. She was heavy, much heavier than he had expected, and the walk back to his horse was one of the most physically demanding things he had ever done. But he managed it, and somehow he got her onto his horse and led them both back to his ranch as the sun began to set over the Arizona mountains. The next several weeks were among the most challenging of Samuel's life. The woman's leg was badly broken, and setting it properly was beyond his limited medical knowledge. He did the best he could, splinting it with wooden boards and cloth strips, and he prayed that it would heal straight enough for her to walk again. She was very sick for the first few days, burning with fever and mumbling in her own language, words that Samuel could not understand but that seemed to be prayers or perhaps memories of people she had lost. He stayed by her side almost constantly, changing the damp cloths on her forehead, spooning broth between her cracked lips, and speaking to her in a quiet voice even though he knew she probably could not hear him. On the fourth day, her fever broke, and she opened her eyes and looked at him with full awareness for the first time since he had brought her to his home. She studied his face for a long moment, and then she spoke. Her English was heavily accented, but understandable. She asked him why he had saved her. She asked if he knew who she was and what it would mean for him if the army found out. Samuel told her the truth. He said that he could not leave any living creature to suffer and die alone, and that he did not much care what the army or anyone else thought about it. He told her that she was safe in his home and that she could stay as long as she needed to heal. Something shifted in her expression then, something that Samuel would later recognize as the first faint stirring of trust. She told him her name was Running Deer, and that she was one of the last of her band to escape from the army patrol that had been hunting them. She did not know what had happened to the others. She feared that she was the only one still alive. Over the following weeks, as Running Deer slowly recovered from her injuries, Samuel learned more about her extraordinary life. She had been born to a chief's daughter and a warrior who was famous among his people for his size and strength. She had inherited her father's remarkable stature, growing taller and stronger than any woman in her tribe, and many of the men as well. Among her people, this was considered a great gift from the spirits, a sign that she was destined for important things. But the gift that had made her special among the Apache had made her a target when the white soldiers came. She was too noticeable, too memorable. No matter how far they ran or where they hid, someone always seemed to remember the giant woman with the fierce eyes. She had become a liability to her people, and when the final disaster came and the army caught them in a narrow canyon, she had been separated from the others in the chaos of the fight. She had run for 3 days with a broken leg before she finally collapsed beside the creek where Samuel found her. As the weeks turned into months, something began to grow between Samuel and Running Deer. At first, it was simply companionship, two lonely people finding comfort in each other's presence. But as Running Deer's leg healed and she began to move around the ranch, helping with the daily chores despite Samuel's protests that she should rest, something deeper began to develop. Samuel had never known a woman like her. She was strong in every sense of the word, physically powerful enough to lift things that he struggled to move, but also strong in spirit, with a quiet dignity that never wavered no matter what hardships she faced. She had lost everything, her family, her people, her entire way of life, but she faced each new day with a courage that humbled him. She was also beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the standards of beauty that Samuel had been taught to value. Her face was broad and strong, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of her ancient people. She stood nearly a full head taller than him, her shoulders wider than his own, her hands large and capable and gentle when they touched his face in the quiet moments they began to share. One evening in the autumn, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun go down, Running Deer told Samuel that her leg was fully healed and that she should probably leave. She did not want to bring trouble to him, and she knew that people in town would eventually discover that he was harboring an Apache woman. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, feeling something tighten in his chest at the thought of her leaving. Then, he told her something that he had been thinking about for weeks but had been too afraid to say out loud. He told her that he did not want her to leave. He told her that his life had been empty before she came, and that she had filled it with something he had not even known he was missing. He told her that he loved her. Running Deer looked at him with those deep, dark eyes, and for a terrible moment Samuel thought she was going to refuse him. But then she smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind the clouds. She told him that she had loved him from the moment he carried her to his horse beside the creek. She had never expected to love a white man, had never imagined that such a thing was possible after everything her people had suffered at the hands of the settlers. But love, she said, did not care about such things. Love came when it wanted and to whom it wanted, and there was no point in fighting it. They were married a week later in a small ceremony that combined elements of both their traditions. Samuel read passages from his mother's old Bible, and Running Deer performed the sacred rituals of her people, invoking the spirits of her ancestors to bless their union. There was no one else present, no witnesses to their vows except the horses in the corral and the hawks circling overhead. But neither of them cared. They had each other, and that was enough. The first year of their marriage was one of the happiest of Samuel's life. Running Deer proved to be an invaluable partner on the ranch, her strength and endurance making it possible to accomplish work that would have taken him twice as long on his own. She learned the ways of cattle ranching with the same quick intelligence that had made her a valued member of her tribe, and she brought her own knowledge of the land and its secrets, teaching Samuel things about the Arizona desert that he had never known. But it was not always easy. Word of Samuel's Apache wife eventually spread to Silver Creek, and the reaction was not kind. Some people refused to do business with him, and others made their feelings known in more direct ways. Samuel found threatening notes nailed to his fence posts, and one night someone set fire to his hay barn. He managed to put out the fire before it spread, but the message was clear. Running Deer urged him to let her go, telling him that she was not worth all the trouble she was causing him. But Samuel refused. He told her that any man who could not stand by his wife in hard times did not deserve to have a wife at all. He told her that they would face whatever came together, and that nothing would ever make him regret the choice he had made. For a time, things seemed to settle down. The people of Silver Creek did not accept Running Deer, but they learned to tolerate her presence. Samuel continued to buy his supplies in town, though he always went alone, leaving Running Deer at the ranch where she would be safe from the hostile stares and whispered insults. It was not the life either of them would have chosen, but it was their life, and they made the best of it. Then came the summer of 1887, and everything changed. It began with rumors of a wealthy stranger who had arrived in Silver Creek. His name was Frederick Whitmore, and he was one of the richest men in the eastern United States. His family had made their fortune in oil and railroads, and Frederick himself was known as a man who always got what he wanted, no matter what it cost. He had come to Arizona looking for land to buy, or at least that was what he told people. The real reason for his visit was something much darker. Samuel first heard about Whitmore from Heinrich Mueller at the general store. The German was clearly impressed by the stranger's wealth and status, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was also a little afraid. He told Samuel that Whitmore was staying at the hotel in town, and that he had been asking a lot of questions about the ranches in the area. Samuel did not think much of it at first. Rich men from the East came to Arizona sometimes, looking for investment opportunities or just seeking adventure in the wild frontier. They usually got bored after a few weeks and went back to their comfortable lives in their big cities. He figured Whitmore would be no different. He was wrong. It was a week later when Samuel rode into town for supplies and found a crowd gathered outside the saloon. In the center of the crowd stood Frederick Whitmore, a tall man in his 40s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of confident posture that came from a lifetime of having other people do what he told them. He was well-dressed in a way that seemed almost ridiculous in the dusty streets of Silver Creek, his white shirt spotless, his black coat perfectly tailored, his boots polished to a high shine. Beside him stood two men who were obviously his bodyguards, large and hard-looking with the cold eyes of men who had done violent things and would do them again without hesitation. There were also several other men who appeared to be his servants or assistants, carrying bags and equipment like they were used to following their master wherever he went. Whitmore was speaking in a loud, carrying voice, telling the gathered crowd about his plans to build a great hunting lodge in the Arizona mountains. He spoke of bringing his wealthy friends from Boston and New York to experience the thrill of hunting wild game in the untamed West. He spoke of the money he would spend, the jobs he would create, the prosperity he would bring to the region. The townspeople listened with the kind of eager attention that people always gave to those who had money. They nodded and murmured approval, already imagining the benefits that Whitmore's wealth might bring to their struggling little town. Samuel watched from the edge of the crowd, feeling a vague unease that he could not quite explain. There was something about Whitmore that bothered him, something in the way the man looked at the world around him as if everything he saw was already his property, just waiting for him to claim it. Then, Whitmore's gaze swept across the crowd and landed on Samuel, and something strange happened. The wealthy man's eyes narrowed slightly, and a small smile curved his thin lips. It was the smile of a predator who had just spotted interesting prey. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine despite the afternoon heat. He did not know why this man was looking at him with such interest, but he was sure that it could not mean anything good. The next day, Samuel learned what had attracted Whitmore's attention. He was working in his corral, breaking a young horse that had been giving him trouble for weeks, when he heard the sound of approaching riders. He looked up to see Whitmore and his two bodyguards coming down the road toward his ranch. The wealthy man was riding a magnificent black stallion that must have cost more than everything Samuel owned, and he sat the horse with the easy confidence of an experienced rider. Samuel climbed out of the corral and waited as the three men approached. He was aware of Running Deer watching from the window of their cabin, and he wished she would stay inside where she would be safe. Whitmore pulled his horse to a stop and looked down at Samuel with that same predatory smile. He introduced himself, as if Samuel had not already heard all about him from the people in town. He spoke in a pleasant, friendly voice, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He told Samuel that he had heard about his ranch and wanted to see it for himself. He said he was interested in buying property in the area and wondered if Samuel might be willing to sell. Samuel told him that the ranch was not for sale. He said it politely but firmly, leaving no room for negotiation. Whitmore did not seem surprised or disappointed. He just smiled that thin smile and said he understood that a man's land was important to him. Then he asked if Samuel would mind showing him around the property anyway, just so he could get a sense of the landscape. Samuel did not want to do this, but he also did not want to make an enemy of such a powerful man without good reason. So he agreed, and for the next hour he led Whitmore around the ranch, showing him the pastures where his cattle grazed, the creek that provided water for the animals, the hills where he sometimes hunted deer and wild turkey. Throughout the tour, Whitmore asked questions about the land, about the climate, about the challenges of ranching in such a harsh environment. His questions were intelligent and showed a genuine understanding of what it took to work the land. But Samuel noticed that the man's eyes kept drifting toward the cabin, as if he was waiting for something. Then, Running Deer stepped outside to dump a bucket of wash water, and Samuel saw the truth in Whitmore's eyes. The man's breath caught in his throat, and his calculating gaze transformed into something far more dangerous: desire. Running Deer was wearing one of her usual work dresses, a simple garment that did nothing to hide her remarkable size and strength. She stood in the sunlight like a monument to feminine power, tall and broad and magnificent. When she turned and saw the strangers looking at her, she straightened to her full height, and met their stares with a fierce dignity that made Samuel's heart swell with pride. Whitmore stared at her for a long moment, and then he turned to Samuel with a new expression on his face. There was hunger there, and excitement, and something that looked almost like triumph. He asked Samuel who the woman was. Samuel told him that she was his wife. Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly, and then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor. He said he had heard rumors about Samuel's unusual marriage, but he had not believed them until now. He said he had never seen anything like her, that she was extraordinary. Samuel did not like the way the man was talking about running deer, as if she were an object to be admired rather than a person. He told Whitmore that the tour was over and that it was time for him to leave. But Whitmore did not move. Instead, he leaned forward in his saddle and spoke in a lower, more confidential tone. He said he was a man who collected extraordinary things. He said he had artifacts from Egypt, sculptures from Greece, paintings from Italy. He said he had always wanted to add something truly unique to his collection, something that no one else in the world possessed. And then he made his offer. He said he would pay Samuel $10,000 for a single night with his wife. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Samuel felt his blood turn to ice in his veins, and then, immediately, to fire. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he had to fight the overwhelming urge to drag this man from his horse and beat him until he could not speak anymore. Whitmore saw the rage in Samuel's eyes, but he did not seem concerned. If anything, he seemed amused. He said that $10,000 was more money than Samuel would see in his entire life, that it could buy him 10 ranches like this one. He said that it was a simple business transaction, nothing more. He said that running deer would be treated well, that she would be returned in the morning without a scratch on her. Samuel's hand moved toward the pistol at his hip. His fingers closed around the worn wooden grip, and for one endless moment he considered doing something that would certainly get him hanged. But before he could act, Whitmore's bodyguards drew their own weapons, faster than Samuel would have believed possible. 2 revolvers were suddenly pointed at his chest, and he knew that if he made a move, he would be dead before his gun cleared the holster. Whitmore smiled again, that thin, cold smile that Samuel was already learning to hate. He said there was no need for unpleasantness, that he was merely making an offer that Samuel was free to refuse. He said he would give Samuel some time to think about it, to consider what $10,000 could mean for his future. He said he would be in town for another week, and that his offer would remain open until then. Then he turned his horse and rode away, his bodyguards following close behind. Samuel stood in his yard and watched them go, his hand still resting on his pistol, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and fear. When they were finally out of sight, he felt a gentle touch on his arm. He turned to find Running Deer standing beside him, her face calm, but her eyes burning with a fierce intensity. She told him that she had heard everything. She told him that she would rather die than let that man touch her. She told him that she was not afraid. Samuel pulled her into his arms and held her as tightly as he could, feeling her strength and warmth surround him. He told her that he would never let anything happen to her, that he would kill any man who tried to take her from him. He told her that they would face this together, just as they had faced everything else. But even as he spoke these brave words, Samuel knew that they were in terrible danger. Frederick Whitmore was not a man who accepted refusal. He had money, power, and influence that Samuel could not hope to match. If he wanted something, he would find a way to get it, and the only thing standing between him and Running Deer was one small rancher with a pistol and a fierce determination to protect his wife. That night, Samuel and Running Deer sat together on their porch as they always did, watching the stars come out one by one in the vast Arizona sky. But the silence between them was heavy with unspoken fears, and the beauty of the night could not dispel the shadow that Whitmore had cast over their lives. Samuel knew that the coming days would bring trouble unlike anything he had ever faced. He knew that he might have to kill or be killed to protect the woman he loved. And he knew that the odds were stacked against him in ways that seemed almost insurmountable. But he also knew that he would not run, and he would not hide, and he would not surrender. He was Samuel Cole, and this was his land and his wife and his life, and no man on earth was going to take them from him. The real battle was only just beginning. The days following Whitmore's visit were tense in ways that Samuel had never experienced before. Every sound in the night made him reach for his rifle. Every rider on the distant road made his heart pound with anticipation of conflict. He found himself watching the horizon constantly, waiting for trouble that he knew was coming but could not predict. Running Deer continued her daily work as if nothing had changed, tending to the animals and the garden with her usual quiet efficiency. But Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the road, the way she stayed closer to the cabin than she usually did. She was afraid, though she would never admit it aloud. On the third day after Whitmore's visit, Samuel rode into Silver Creek to buy ammunition and to listen to what people were saying about the wealthy stranger from Boston. What he heard made his blood run cold. Whitmore had been busy. He had been meeting with the town's most influential citizens, buying drinks at the saloon, making generous donations to the church and the school. He had hired several local men as guides and laborers for his hunting lodge project, paying them wages that were far above what anyone else in the territory could afford. In just a few days, he had made himself one of the most popular figures in town. But that was not the worst of it. Whitmore had also been talking about Samuel and Running Deer. He had not said anything directly offensive, not in public anyway. Instead, he had expressed concern about the situation. He had wondered aloud whether it was proper for a white man to be living with an Apache woman. He had suggested that perhaps Samuel had been coerced or deceived in some way. He had implied that Running Deer might be dangerous, that she might be in contact with other Apache who were planning attacks on the settlers. These poisonous suggestions had spread through the town like wildfire, finding fertile ground in the hearts of people who had never fully accepted Samuel's marriage. Now, instead of just avoiding him, people were actively hostile. They refused to serve him at the general store until Heinrich Mueller intervened. They spat on the ground when he walked past. One man called him a savage lover to his face, and only backed down when Samuel's hand moved toward his gun. Samuel left town that day with the supplies he needed, but with a heavy heart. Whitmore was not just a wealthy man who wanted something that did not belong to him. He was a strategist, a manipulator who understood how to turn a community against one of its own. He was isolating Samuel, cutting him off from any potential allies, making sure that when the final confrontation came, Samuel would stand alone. That night, Samuel told Running Deer what he had learned. She listened in silence, her face betraying nothing of what she felt inside. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then, she told him something that surprised him. She said that Whitmore was not the first man to look at her with those eyes, with that hunger that had nothing to do with love or respect. She said that even among her own people, there had been men who saw her size and strength as something to be conquered, as a challenge to their manhood. She said she had learned long ago how to recognize such men and how to protect herself from them. But this was different, she admitted. This man had power that none of those others had possessed. He could not simply be faced in single combat and defeated. He fought with money and influence and the slow poison of words, and these were weapons against which her strength was useless. Samuel took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. He told her that they would find a way. He did not know how yet, but he promised her that Whitmore would not win. He promised her that their life together was worth fighting for, and that he would do whatever it took to protect it. Running Deer smiled at him then, a sad but genuine smile that made his heart ache with love for her. She told him that she knew he would fight for her. She told him that she had known it from the first moment she looked into his eyes beside the creek all those years ago. She told him that whatever happened, she was grateful for the time they had shared together. Samuel wanted to tell her that they would have many more years together, that this was just a temporary danger that they would overcome. But the words stuck in his throat, because he was not sure they were true. So instead, he just held her close and listened to the beating of her heart, and they sat together in silence as the night grew dark around them. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Samuel was feeding the horses when he heard the sound of a single rider approaching. His hand went to his pistol, but he relaxed slightly when he saw that it was just one person, a woman on a brown mare. As she got closer, he recognized her as Maria Vasquez, a Mexican woman who ran a small boarding house in Silver Creek. Maria pulled her horse to a stop and looked at Samuel with worried eyes. She said she had come to warn him about something she had overheard at her boarding house the night before. Two of Whitmore's men had been drinking in her kitchen after the saloon closed, talking loudly without regard for who might be listening. They had been laughing about their employer's obsession with the Apache woman, joking about what would happen when Whitmore finally lost patience with waiting. One of them had said that Whitmore had already sent for more men from Tucson, hired guns who would arrive within a few days. The other had said that Whitmore had never failed to get what he wanted, and that this stupid rancher was going to learn that lesson the hard way. Samuel felt his stomach clench with fear and anger. He thanked Maria for the warning and asked her why she had taken the risk of coming to tell him. Maria's face grew hard with old memories. She said that Whitmore reminded her of men she had known in Mexico, men who believed that their money gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. She said she had seen what such men did to women who caught their attention, and she would not stand by and let it happen again if she could help it. She also told Samuel something else, something that gave him a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She said that not everyone in Silver Creek was against him. There were others who saw through Whitmore's charm and recognized him for what he really was. They were afraid to speak out openly, but they were watching and waiting. If Samuel could find a way to stand up to Whitmore and survive, he might find more support than he expected. After Maria left, Samuel spent a long time thinking about what she had told him. More hired guns were coming. That meant he was running out of time. He could not simply wait for Whitmore to make his move. He needed to do something to change the balance of power, to show the wealthy man that he was not dealing with an easy target. But what could he do? He had no money to hire men of his own. He had no powerful friends who could stand against Whitmore's influence. All he had was his gun, his courage, and his determination to protect his wife. And against a small army of hired killers, those things might not be enough. It was Running Deer who came up with the plan. She found Samuel sitting on the porch that afternoon, staring at the horizon with troubled eyes. She sat down beside him and was quiet for a moment, and then she began to speak in a low, thoughtful voice. She told him about a place she knew in the mountains, a hidden canyon that her people had used for generations as a refuge in times of danger. It was a natural fortress, accessible only through a narrow passage that could be defended by a single person against many attackers. There was water there, and game, and caves that could provide shelter from the elements. She said that if Whitmore's men came in force, they could retreat to this canyon and hold out indefinitely. No amount of hired guns could reach them there, and eventually Whitmore would have to give up and return to his life in Boston. Samuel considered the idea. It had merit, but it also had problems. If they fled to the mountains, they would have to abandon the ranch. Everything he had worked for, everything they had built together, would be lost. Whitmore would probably claim the land for himself, and even if they survived, they would have nothing to come back to. Running Deer understood his hesitation. She told him that she knew what the ranch meant to him, that she knew how hard he had worked to build it. But she also reminded him that a ranch could be rebuilt, while a life could not. She said that their love was worth more than any piece of land, and that as long as they were together, they could start over anywhere. Samuel knew she was right, but something in him rebelled against the idea of running. He had never run from anything in his life, and the thought of fleeing from Whitmore like a frightened rabbit made his jaw clench with stubborn pride. Running Deer saw the conflict in his eyes. She touched his face gently and told him that there was no shame in choosing to live. She said that the bravest warriors of her people had always known when to fight and when to retreat, when to stand their ground, and when to live to fight another day. She said that running from a battle you cannot win is not cowardice. It is wisdom. Samuel took a deep breath and nodded slowly. He told her that she was right, that he had been thinking like a fool. He said they would prepare for a retreat to the canyon, gathering supplies and making plans for the journey. But he also said that he would not leave without making Whitmore understand that there would be a cost for his pursuit. He said that he would give the man one chance to walk away, and if he refused, Samuel would make sure he regretted it. The next 2 days were filled with frantic preparation. Samuel and Running Deer packed supplies into saddlebags, selecting the items they would need to survive in the wilderness for an extended period. They chose their best horses, the ones most suited for the difficult mountain terrain. They buried some of their more valuable possessions, things that were too heavy to carry but too precious to leave for Whitmore to claim. It was the distant rumble of many hooves on hard ground, coming from the direction of town. He looked up and saw a cloud of dust rising on the horizon, and he knew that their time had run out. He shouted for Running Deer to come quickly. She emerged from the cabin with her rifle in her hands, her face set in an expression of fierce determination. Together they watched as the riders approached, counting the figures as they emerged from the dust cloud. There were 12 of them, not including Whitmore himself. They were hard-looking men, the kind who hired out their guns to anyone who would pay for them. They wore their weapons openly, and rode their horses with the easy confidence of men who had faced violence before and expected to face it again. Whitmore was at the head of the group, still mounted on his magnificent black stallion, still dressed in his immaculate Eastern clothes. He looked as calm and composed as if he were riding to a social engagement rather than to commit an act of violence. When he saw Samuel and Running Deer waiting for him, he smiled that thin, cold smile that Samuel had come to hate. The riders spread out as they approached the ranch, surrounding the property in a loose circle that cut off any chance of escape. Samuel realized with a sinking heart that they had waited too long. If they tried to run now, they would be caught before they could reach the safety of the mountains. Whitmore stopped his horse about 20 feet from where Samuel and Running Deer stood. His bodyguards flanked him on either side, their hands resting on the butts of their pistols. The other riders remained in their encircling positions, watching with the patient attention of wolves waiting for their prey to make a move. Whitmore spoke in a pleasant, conversational tone, as if they were old friends meeting by chance. He said he had given Samuel plenty of time to consider his offer, and he was curious to hear the answer. He said he hoped they could resolve this matter peacefully, without any unpleasantness. He said he really did not want anyone to get hurt. Samuel felt Running Deer move closer to him, felt the warmth of her body against his side. He drew strength from her presence, from the knowledge that whatever happened, they would face it together. He told Whitmore that his answer was the same as it had been before, and that it would always be the same. He said that Running Deer was his wife, not his property, and that she was not for sale at any price. He said that if Whitmore wanted her, he would have to go through Samuel first, and that he was prepared to die defending her if necessary. Whitmore's smile did not waver. He said he had expected that response, and that he respected Samuel's devotion to his wife. But he also said that he had not become one of the richest men in America by accepting no for an answer. He said that he always got what he wanted, one way or another, and that this situation would be no different. He made Samuel a new offer. Instead of paying him for one night with Running Deer, he would pay him to simply leave. He would give Samuel $20,000, twice the original amount, in exchange for walking away and never coming back. He would give Samuel a new start somewhere far away, in California or Oregon or wherever he chose to go. All he had to do was leave Running Deer behind. Samuel felt a rage building inside him, a fury so intense that it threatened to overwhelm his reason. He wanted to draw his gun and start shooting, to take as many of these men with him as he could before they cut him down. But he forced himself to remain calm, knowing that any violent action would only ensure Running Deer's capture. He told Whitmore that he would not take his money. He said that Running Deer was not a horse or a piece of land that could be bought and sold. He said that she was his wife, his partner, his equal in every way. He said that there was no amount of money in the world that could make him abandon her. Something shifted in Whitmore's expression then. The pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly and dangerous underneath. His voice, when he spoke again, was harder and colder than before. He told Samuel that he was making a terrible mistake. He said that he had been patient and generous, offering far more than the situation required. But his patience had limits, and Samuel was rapidly approaching them. He said that if Samuel did not accept one of his offers, he would simply take what he wanted by force, and then Samuel would have nothing at all. Samuel's hand moved toward his pistol, but before he could touch it, he felt Running Deer's fingers close around his wrist. He looked at her and saw something unexpected in her eyes. It was not fear or desperation. It was a calm, controlled fury, and beneath that, something that looked almost like a plan. She stepped forward, moving past Samuel until she stood between him and Whitmore. The wealthy man's eyes widened slightly at her approach, and, for the first time, Samuel saw something like uncertainty flicker across his face. Running Deer spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the evening air. She told Whitmore that she had something to say to him, and that he should listen carefully because she would not repeat herself. She told him that she was not the helpless prey he imagined her to be. She told him that she was a daughter of the Apache, a people who had fought and survived against enemies far more dangerous than him. She told him that her ancestors had lived in these lands for thousands of years before his people had ever heard of America, and that their blood ran in her veins and gave her a strength that he could not understand. She told him that she had killed men before. She said it simply, without boasting or threatening, just stating a fact. She said that when the soldiers had attacked her people, she had fought alongside the warriors, and she had not been the one to fall. She said that if Whitmore tried to take her, she would fight with every ounce of strength in her body, and that she would make sure he paid a price for his victory that he would never forget. She told him to look at her, really look at her, and ask himself if he wanted to find out what she could do when she was truly angry. She said that even if his men managed to subdue her, she would never stop fighting. She would make his life a living hell every moment she was in his possession, and, in the end, he would beg her to leave. The hired guns shifted uneasily in their saddles. They had been expecting an easy job, a simple matter of intimidating a lone rancher into submission. They had not expected this fierce woman who spoke of killing as casually as other women spoke of cooking or sewing. Some of them exchanged uncertain glances, perhaps wondering if the money they were being paid was really worth the trouble. Whitmore stared at Running Deer for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he laughed, but this time there was an edge to the sound that had not been there before. He said she was even more magnificent than he had realized, that her spirit was as remarkable as her physical presence. He said she would make a wonderful addition to his collection, and that breaking her would be the greatest challenge of his life. But even as he spoke these words, Samuel could see that something had changed. Running Deer's speech had unsettled him, had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He was not used to his victims fighting back, and he was not sure how to handle it. Running Deer pressed her advantage. She told Whitmore that she was going to make him a counteroffer, one that he would be wise to consider carefully. She said that she would meet him in single combat, just the two of them, with no weapons except their bare hands. If he won, she would go with him willingly and would not resist anything he wanted to do with her. But if she won, he would leave and never come back, and he would give Samuel twice the amount he had originally offered. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath, sensing the tension in the air. Samuel wanted to object, wanted to tell Running Deer that he would never allow her to put herself at such risk. But something in her eyes told him to trust her, to have faith in the woman he had married. So he held his tongue and waited to see what would happen. Whitmore considered the offer. His eyes moved over Running Deer's body, assessing her size and strength, calculating his chances. He was a tall man and reasonably fit, but Running Deer towered over him by several inches and was clearly built for physical power. The outcome of such a fight would be far from certain. But there was something else in his expression, something that Samuel recognized as the same hunger that had been there from the beginning. Whitmore was attracted to the challenge. He wanted to prove that he could conquer this remarkable woman not just with his money and his hired guns, but with his own hands. His ego demanded it. He asked her why she would make such an offer. He said she had everything to lose and nothing to gain. Running Deer smiled, a fierce expression that showed her teeth. She said that was where he was wrong. She said that she would rather face him in honest combat than be hunted down like an animal. She said that if she was going to be captured, she would make sure it was because she was truly beaten, not because she was outnumbered by men with guns. She also said something else, something that made Whitmore's face flush with anger. She said that she could see the truth about him, the truth that he hid from the world with his money and his fancy clothes. She said that he was a weak man, a man who had never had to fight for anything in his life, a man who hired others to do his dirty work because he was too cowardly to do it himself. She said that if he refused her challenge, everyone here would know that she was right about him. The hired guns were watching their employer now, waiting to see how he would respond to this public questioning of his manhood. Several of them had small smiles on their faces, enjoying the show. They had no loyalty to Whitmore beyond the money he paid them, and watching him squirm was entertainment. Whitmore's jaw tightened with barely suppressed fury. He was caught between his caution and his pride, knowing that accepting the challenge was risky, but also knowing that refusing it would make him look weak in front of his men. For a long moment, the scales seemed balanced on a knife's edge. Then, he smiled, and Samuel knew that Running Deer had won this round of the game. Whitmore said he would accept her challenge. He said he would meet her in single combat, with no weapons and no interference from anyone else. He said he would prove that all her fierce words meant nothing against a man of true strength and determination. But he added a condition. He said the fight would take place in town, in the center of Silver Creek where everyone could witness it. He said he wanted the whole community to see what happened when someone dared to defy Frederick Whitmore. He said it would be a lesson that no one would ever forget. Running Deer agreed without hesitation. She said she would meet him in the town square at noon the following day. She said she would be there, and he had better not be late. Whitmore nodded curtly and turned his horse around. He gestured to his men, and they followed him as he rode away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air behind them. Samuel rushed to Running Deer's side as soon as the riders were out of sight. He asked her what she was doing, why she had put herself at such risk. He said that Whitmore was dangerous, that he would not fight fair, that there was no way to trust him to keep his word. Running Deer took his face in her hands and looked into his eyes. She told him that she knew all of these things, and she had a plan to deal with them. She said that Whitmore's pride was his weakness, and she intended to exploit it. She said that by making the fight public, she was ensuring that he would have to play by the rules, at least until the combat was over. Whatever happened afterward, she would face it with clear eyes and no regrets. She also told him something that made his heart clench with a mixture of fear and pride. She said that she was not afraid to fight this man. She said that she had been waiting for the chance to confront him directly, to show him what she was really made of. She said that she was tired of being hunted, and it was time to become the hunter. That night, Samuel and Running Deer made love with a desperate intensity, as if they were trying to hold on to each other against the forces that threatened to tear them apart. They spoke of their love, of their hopes, of the life they had built together against all odds. They promised each other that whatever happened tomorrow, they would face it together. In the quiet hours before dawn, as Running Deer slept beside him, Samuel made a promise of his own. He swore that he would protect her no matter what, that he would not let Whitmore take her even if the wealthy man somehow won the fight. He knew that this might mean his own death, but he did not care. Some things were worth dying for, and Running Deer was one of them. The sun rose on what would become the most important day of their lives. The fight for everything they loved was about to begin. The morning of the fight dawned hot and still, with a heavy sky that promised storms before nightfall. Samuel woke before sunrise, his body tense with anticipation and dread. Beside him, Running Deer still slept, her breathing slow and even, her face peaceful in a way that seemed impossible given what lay ahead. He lay there for a while, watching her and trying to memorize every detail of her face. The strong line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, the way her black hair spread across the pillow like a river of night. He had loved many things in his life, his land, his horses, the wild beauty of the Arizona desert. But he had never loved anything the way he loved this woman, and the thought of losing her was more than he could bear. Running Deer's eyes opened, and for a moment she just looked at him with an expression of perfect contentment. Then she smiled and reached out to touch his face, her calloused fingers gentle against his cheek. She told him that she could feel his fear, that it was radiating from him like heat from a fire. She said she understood why he was afraid, but she wanted him to know that she was not. She said that she had faced death many times in her life, and she had learned that the worst thing about it was not the dying itself, but the fear of dying. If she could let go of that fear, she could face anything. Samuel wanted to argue with her, to tell her that this was different, that Whitmore was more dangerous than any enemy she had ever faced. But he knew that his words would only add to the burden she was already carrying. So instead, he just held her close and tried to draw strength from her calm. They rose with the sun and prepared for the journey into town. Running Deer dressed in her simplest clothes, a plain cotton dress and sturdy boots, nothing that would restrict her movement or give Whitmore something to grab onto. She braided her hair tightly against her head and wrapped it with leather cords, keeping it out of her way and out of her opponent's reach. Samuel cleaned and loaded his pistol, checking it twice to make sure it was in perfect working order. He hoped he would not have to use it, but he would be ready if things went wrong. He also tucked a knife into his boot, a weapon of last resort that might save them if everything else failed. They ate a simple breakfast of bread and dried meat, neither of them having much appetite. Then, they saddled their horses and set out for Silver Creek, riding side by side through the golden morning light. The ride took about 2 hours, and for most of that time they traveled in silence. There was nothing left to say, no words that could adequately express what they were feeling. They just rode together, taking comfort in each other's presence, drawing strength from the bond that had sustained them through so many trials. As they approached the town, Samuel began to notice something unusual. The road was busier than normal, with riders and wagons heading in the same direction they were traveling. Word of the fight had clearly spread, and it seemed like half the territory was coming to witness the spectacle. By the time they reached Silver Creek, the town was more crowded than Samuel had ever seen it. People lined the streets, standing on porches and balconies, climbing onto rooftops for a better view. There were men he recognized from neighboring ranches, families from distant homesteads, even some faces that he did not know at all. They had all come to see what would happen when the wealthy man from Boston faced the giant Apache woman in single combat. The atmosphere was strange, a mixture of excitement and tension that hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Some people watched with eager anticipation, treating the event like entertainment. Others looked worried or frightened, sensing that what was about to happen would have consequences that reached far beyond this single fight. Samuel spotted Maria Vasquez in the crowd and nodded to her. She nodded back, her face grim but encouraging. He also saw Heinrich Mueller standing near his store, his expression anxious but not hostile. There were others too, people who had avoided him since word of his marriage became public, now looking at him with something that might have been sympathy or even respect. He guided his horse through the packed streets toward the center of town, where a large open space had been cleared for the fight. Running Deer rode beside him, her head held high, meeting the stares of the crowd with the same fierce dignity that she had shown since the first day he had known her. Whitmore was already waiting when they arrived. He stood in the center of the cleared space, surrounded by his hired guns, wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark trousers tucked into his polished boots. He looked fit and confident, like a man who was certain of victory. His bodyguards flanked him on either side, their hands resting on their weapons, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. When he saw Running Deer approach, his face lit up with that familiar predatory smile. He called out to her, saying that he was glad she had come, that he had been afraid she might lose her nerve at the last moment. He said he was looking forward to this more than he had looked forward to anything in years. Running Deer dismounted and handed her reins to Samuel without looking away from Whitmore. She walked toward him with the measured stride of a warrior approaching battle, her movements deliberate and controlled. The crowd fell silent as she passed, everyone sensing that something momentous was about to happen. She stopped about 10 feet from Whitmore and studied him with her dark eyes. She told him that she was ready whenever he was. She said there was no need for further talk. She said it was time to see what he was really made of. The local sheriff, a thin man named Wilson who had always been uncomfortable around Running Deer, stepped forward to act as referee. He announced the rules of the fight in a nervous voice. No weapons, no interference from anyone else, and the fight would continue until one person was unable to continue or surrendered. He asked both fighters if they understood and accepted these rules. Whitmore nodded confidently. Running Deer simply bowed her head once, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no words. Sheriff Wilson stepped back, looking relieved to be out of the way. He raised his hand, held it there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, and then brought it down sharply. The fight began. Whitmore moved first, circling to his right with his hands raised in the stance of a trained boxer. He had clearly received some instruction in the art of fighting, probably from expensive tutors in Boston. His footwork was crisp and controlled, his movements efficient and purposeful. Running Deer did not move at all. She stood perfectly still, watching him circle her with eyes that missed nothing. Her weight was balanced evenly on both feet, her arms hanging loose at her sides. She looked relaxed, almost casual, but Samuel could see the coiled tension in her muscles, ready to explode into action at a moment's notice. Whitmore threw a quick jab, testing her defenses. Running Deer tilted her head just enough to let the punch whistle past her ear, never breaking eye contact, never changing her expression. The crowd murmured in surprise. They had expected the fight to be quick and decisive, one way or the other. They had not expected this patient, calculated dance. Whitmore tried again, this time with a combination of punches aimed at her body and face. Running Deer moved like water, flowing around his attacks without seeming to hurry. She did not try to block his punches. She simply was not there when they arrived. Her movements were so smooth and natural that they almost seemed effortless. Samuel watched with a mixture of fear and amazement. He had known that Running Deer was strong, but he had never seen her fight like this. She moved with a grace and precision that spoke of years of training, of skills passed down through generations of Apache warriors. She was not just a big woman with natural strength. She was a fighter, trained and deadly. Whitmore's confidence began to waver. He had expected to overwhelm her with his speed and technique, to prove his superiority in the first few seconds of the fight. Instead, he was swinging at air while she watched him with those dark, unreadable eyes. He was starting to look foolish, and he knew it. He changed tactics, abandoning his cautious boxing approach for a more aggressive strategy. He rushed at Running Deer, trying to use his momentum to take her off her feet. If he could get her on the ground, his weight and leverage might give him an advantage. But Running Deer was ready for him. As he charged forward, she stepped to the side and grabbed his arm, using his own momentum against him. She pivoted smoothly and threw him over her hip, sending him crashing to the hard-packed dirt with a force that drove the air from his lungs. The crowd gasped. Several of the hired guns started to move forward, but Running Deer's voice stopped them cold. She told them that if any of them interfered, she would break their employer's neck before they could take 2 steps. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather rather than threatening murder. Whitmore struggled to his feet, his face red with exertion and embarrassment. His pristine white shirt was now streaked with dirt, and there was a cut on his forehead where he had struck a rock when he fell. He looked at Running Deer with new eyes, finally, understanding that he had gravely underestimated her. He attacked again, more carefully this time. He threw punches with controlled force, probing for weaknesses, looking for openings. Running Deer let a few of his lighter blows land, taking the impact on her arms and shoulders without flinching. She was testing him now, learning his patterns, identifying his habits. Then, she struck back. Her first punch caught Whitmore square in the chest, driving him backward and making him gasp for breath. Her second punch, a hook to his ribs, bent him double with pain. Her third punch, an uppercut that came from somewhere near her knees, lifted him completely off his feet and sent him crashing to the ground again. The crowd roared. Many of them had never seen a woman fight like this, had never imagined that such a thing was possible. They watched in awe as Running Deer stood over her fallen opponent, waiting patiently for him to rise. Whitmore got up more slowly this time. There was blood on his face now, streaming from his nose, and the cut on his forehead. His confident smile was gone, replaced by an expression of pain and growing fear. He had never been hurt like this in his life, never been so thoroughly outmatched by anyone. He was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake, but his pride would not let him surrender. He raised his fists and came at her again, desperation lending strength to his attacks. He swung wildly, throwing every ounce of power he had into each punch, hoping that one lucky blow might turn the tide. Running Deer took some of these blows, allowing them to land when they could not be easily avoided. But they did not seem to affect her. She absorbed the impact with her powerful body and kept coming, her own strikes landing with devastating precision. The fight went on for what seemed like hours, but was probably only about 15 minutes. Throughout that time, Running Deer systematically dismantled her opponent. She broke his nose with a straight punch. She cracked his ribs with a knee strike. She opened cuts above both his eyes with her hard knuckles, making it difficult for him to see. But she did not finish him. She held back her full strength, deliberately prolonging the fight, giving the crowd plenty of time to see Whitmore's defeat. She was not just trying to win. She was trying to humiliate him, to destroy his reputation as completely as he had tried to destroy hers. Samuel watched with a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in his wife's incredible skill, relief that she was winning, but also something like pity for Whitmore, who had been so confident and was now so thoroughly beaten. The man was a villain, certainly, but there was something pathetic about watching him reduced to this bloody, stumbling wreck. Finally, mercifully, the end came. Running Deer caught Whitmore with a devastating kick to his midsection that folded him in half. As he doubled over, she grabbed his head with both hands and brought her knee up into his face with sickening force. There was an audible crack, and Whitmore collapsed to the ground and did not move. Sheriff Wilson rushed forward to check on the fallen man. After a tense moment, he announced that Whitmore was still alive, just unconscious. He declared Running Deer the winner of the fight. The crowd erupted in chaos. Some people cheered, celebrating the unlikely victory. Others shouted in anger, outraged that a wealthy white man had been so thoroughly beaten by an Apache woman. The hired guns huddled together, uncertain what to do now that their employer was no longer able to give orders. Running Deer walked slowly back to where Samuel was waiting. Her face showed no triumph, no satisfaction. If anything, she looked tired and sad, as if the fight had cost her something that went beyond physical exertion. Samuel helped her onto her horse and mounted his own. They needed to get out of town quickly, before the chaos resolved itself into something more dangerous. Whatever protection the public fight had provided was rapidly evaporating. They rode out of Silver Creek at a controlled pace, not running but not dawdling either. The crowd parted before them, people stepping aside to let them pass. Some faces showed respect, others hostility. But no one tried to stop them. They were about half a mile from town when Samuel heard the sound he had been dreading. Hoofbeats behind them, coming fast. He turned in his saddle and saw a group of riders closing in on them, at least 8 or 9 men. Most of them were Whitmore's hired guns, but he also recognized a few faces from town, men who had drunk too much at the saloon and decided to seek their own kind of justice. He looked at Running Deer. Her face was grim, but not surprised. She had known this might happen, had known that Whitmore's men would not simply let them ride away after what she had done to their employer. She nodded once, confirming what they both understood. They spurred their horses to a gallop, racing for the sanctuary of the hills. The mountains where Running Deer's hidden canyon waited were still miles away, but there were other places to take cover, other positions where they might be able to make a stand. The riders behind them were gaining. Their horses were fresh, while Samuel and Running Deer's mounts had already traveled the long distance from their ranch. It was going to be close. They crested a ridge, and Samuel spotted a rocky outcropping about a quarter-mile ahead. It was not ideal, but it offered some protection and would force their pursuers to dismount and approach on foot. He pointed it out to Running Deer, and she nodded agreement. They reached the rocks moments before the riders appeared on the ridge behind them. Samuel helped Running Deer dismount and grabbed his rifle from its scabbard. They scrambled up the rocks and found a position behind a large boulder that gave them a clear view of the approaching enemy. The hired guns had spread out, approaching cautiously now that their quarry had gone to ground. They knew that a desperate man with a rifle could take a heavy toll before they overwhelmed him. Several of them were carrying their own rifles, ready for a prolonged standoff. Samuel counted the approaching figures. 9 men, all armed, all dangerous. The odds were impossibly long, but he had no intention of surrendering, and he knew that Running Deer felt the same. He told her that he loved her. He said it simply and quietly, without drama or desperation. He just wanted her to know, in case these were the last words he ever spoke. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. She told him that she loved him too, that she had loved him from the moment he carried her to his horse beside the creek. She said that whatever happened now, she would face it at his side, and that she was grateful for every moment they had shared. The riders stopped about 100 yards away, just out of effective rifle range. One of them, a hard-faced man with a scarred cheek who seemed to be the leader, called out to Samuel. He said there was no point in prolonging this. He said they just wanted the woman, and if Samuel gave her up, they would let him ride away unharmed. He said it was a generous offer, all things considered. Samuel's response was a rifle shot that kicked up dust at the man's feet. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation. The hired guns took cover behind rocks and in depressions in the ground. A few return shots cracked through the air, but they fell short, the range too great for accurate fire. It was going to be a siege, a slow, grinding battle of patience and ammunition. The afternoon wore on. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Samuel's throat grew dry with thirst. They had water in their saddlebags, but the horses were tethered too far away to reach without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Running Deer bore the discomfort without complaint, keeping watch while Samuel rested, and vice versa. As the shadows began to lengthen, Samuel started to worry about what would happen when night fell. The darkness would allow the hired guns to approach unseen, to surround them completely, and overwhelm them with sheer numbers. If they were going to survive, they needed something to change before sunset. Then, something did change, though not in any way that Samuel had expected. A new sound reached his ears, the distant thunder of many horses. For a terrible moment, he thought it was reinforcements for the hired guns, more men coming to ensure that he and Running Deer could not escape. But, as the sound grew closer, he realized that it was coming from a different direction, from the road that led deeper into the territory. He risked a look over the boulder, and saw a sight that made his heart leap with desperate hope. A column of riders was approaching, at least 20 of them, and at their head rode a figure in a blue cavalry uniform. The army had arrived. The hired guns saw the approaching soldiers too, and their behavior changed immediately. They abandoned their positions and ran for their horses, mounting up and scattering in all directions. They had no interest in explaining to the army why they were trying to murder a rancher and his wife. The cavalry patrol rode past the fleeing men without stopping, clearly more interested in the situation at the rocks than in chasing random fugitives. The lead officer pulled his horse to a stop below Samuel's position and looked up at him with curious eyes. He introduced himself as Lieutenant James Morrison of the 4th Cavalry Regiment. He said his patrol had been riding through the area had heard gunfire. He asked if Samuel and Running Deer needed assistance. Samuel was so relieved that he could barely speak. He managed to explain what had happened: the wealthy man from Boston, his attempts to buy or take Running Deer, the fight in town, and the pursuit that had led them to this place. Lieutenant Morrison listened with an expression of growing concern. When Samuel finished, the officer was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what he had heard. Then, he said something that surprised Samuel more than anything else that had happened that day. He said that he had heard of Frederick Whitmore. He said the man had a reputation in certain circles, a reputation for doing whatever it took to get what he wanted. He said there had been rumors of similar incidents in other places, though nothing that had ever been proven. He said he was glad that Running Deer had been able to defend herself, and that he personally had no intention of allowing Whitmore to continue his pursuit. Samuel asked what he meant. He said he thought the army would take Whitmore's side, would view Running Deer as just another Apache to be subdued or eliminated. Lieutenant Morrison shook his head. He said that times were changing, slowly and painfully, but changing nonetheless. He said that not everyone in the army shared the prejudices of the past, and that he personally believed that all people, regardless of their heritage, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. He offered to escort Samuel and Running Deer back to their ranch and to ensure that Whitmore's men did not trouble them again. He said he could not promise anything beyond that, but he would do what he could to see that justice was served. Samuel accepted the offer gratefully. He helped Running Deer down from the rocks, and together they mounted their horses and joined the cavalry patrol. As they rode toward home, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. For the first time since Whitmore had ridden onto his property, Samuel felt a flicker of hope. They had survived this day against all odds. Running Deer had proven herself in combat, had shown the world what she was capable of. And now, against all expectations, they had found an ally in the very army that had once hunted her people. But Samuel knew that this was not over. Whitmore was still alive, still wealthy, still powerful. He would recover from his injuries and from his humiliation, and when he did, he would want revenge. The battle had been won, but the war was far from finished. As they rode into the gathering darkness, Samuel made himself another promise. He would be ready for whatever came next. He would protect his wife and his home with everything he had. And if Whitmore, the weeks that followed the fight brought changes that Samuel had never anticipated. Lieutenant Morrison proved to be as good as his word, establishing a temporary camp near Silver Creek and making it clear that any harassment of Samuel or Running Deer would be treated as a serious matter. The hired guns who had pursued them scattered to the winds, unwilling to risk confrontation with the army. Frederick Whitmore, badly injured and reportedly furious beyond measure, was taken to Tucson by his remaining servants to receive proper medical care. For the first time since Whitmore's arrival, Samuel and Running Deer were able to live their lives without constant fear. They returned to the rhythms of ranch work, tending their cattle and horses, maintaining their property, building for a future that suddenly seemed possible again. Running Deer's victory had not erased all the prejudice against them, but it had earned them a measure of respect that had not existed before. People who had once spat at the sight of them now nodded cautiously when they passed on the road. The change in Silver Creek was gradual but unmistakable. The story of the fight spread far beyond the town's borders, carried by travelers and traders to every corner of the territory. Running Deer became something of a legend, the giant Apache woman who had defeated a wealthy Boston tycoon in single combat. Some versions of the story exaggerated her size and strength to mythic proportions, while others focused on the romantic aspects of her relationship with Samuel. But all versions agreed on one essential truth: she was not a woman to be trifled with. Heinrich Müller, the German store owner who had always treated Samuel fairly, became openly friendly toward the couple. He told Samuel that he had never supported the hostility that Running Deer faced, but he had been afraid to speak out against it. Now he felt differently. He said that Running Deer had shown the whole town what true courage looked like, and he was proud to know her. Maria Vasquez continued her friendship with them, often riding out to their ranch to share news and conversation. She told them stories about the changing attitudes in town, about people who were beginning to question the assumptions they had always taken for granted. Not everyone was ready to accept an Apache woman as an equal, but the number of open enemies was shrinking daily. Lieutenant Morrison visited several times before his patrol moved on to other duties. He was a thoughtful man, well-read and curious about the world, and he seemed genuinely interested in Running Deer's culture and history. She told him stories about her people, about their traditions and beliefs, about the life they had lived before the white settlers came. He listened with respectful attention, asking questions that showed he wanted to understand rather than judge. Before he left, Morrison warned Samuel that Whitmore would almost certainly try again. He said that men like Whitmore did not accept defeat gracefully, that their pride would demand some kind of revenge. He urged Samuel to remain vigilant and to send word to the nearest army post if any trouble arose. He also left a letter with Sheriff Wilson, documenting everything that had happened and instructing local authorities to take any complaints from Samuel and Running Deer seriously. The warning proved prophetic, though not in the way anyone had expected. It was early autumn when the first sign of trouble appeared. Samuel rode into town for supplies and noticed that people were acting strangely. They avoided his eyes, spoke in hushed voices, and seemed nervous about something they were unwilling to discuss. When he asked Heinrich what was wrong, the store owner hesitated for a long moment before answering. A lawyer from Boston had arrived in Silver Creek. He was staying at the hotel and had been meeting with various townspeople, asking questions and making notes. He claimed to represent Frederick Whitmore's interests and said he was gathering information for a legal matter that would soon become public. Samuel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He had expected Whitmore to send more hired guns, to try again with violence what he had failed to achieve before. He had not expected a legal attack, and he was not sure how to defend against one. He rode home as quickly as he could and told Running Deer what he had learned. She received the news with her usual calm, but he could see the worry behind her eyes. They both knew that the law was not on their side. Their marriage was recognized by no government, and Running Deer's status as an Apache made her vulnerable in ways that neither of them fully understood. The lawyer's purpose became clear 2 days later, when Sheriff Wilson rode out to their ranch with a grim expression on his face. He was carrying a bundle of legal documents that looked official and intimidating, and he apologized before he even dismounted. He explained that Whitmore was suing Samuel for assault and battery, claiming that Running Deer's attack had been unprovoked and had caused him grievous bodily harm. The lawsuit sought damages of $50,000, an amount that would bankrupt Samuel many times over. There was also a separate action seeking to have Running Deer arrested and tried for attempted murder. Samuel stared at the documents in disbelief. The claims were absurd on their face. The fight had been public, witnessed by dozens of people who had seen Whitmore agree to the terms and throw the first punch. But he knew that truth meant little in a legal system that was designed by and for wealthy white men. Sheriff Wilson seemed to share his doubts about the lawsuit. He said that he had been ordered to serve the papers, but he also said that he did not believe the charges had any merit. He said that anyone who had witnessed the fight knew that Running Deer had done nothing wrong, and that Whitmore's claims were motivated by wounded pride rather than genuine grievance. But he also warned Samuel that Whitmore's money could buy a lot of influence. The lawyer from Boston had been making promises and offering payments to people who might be willing to testify against Running Deer. Several of the townspeople who had cheered her victory were now reconsidering their positions, tempted by the prospect of easy money. After Sheriff Wilson left, Samuel and Running Deer sat together on their porch and tried to make sense of what was happening. They were farmers and ranchers, people who worked the land and raised animals. They knew nothing about lawyers and lawsuits and legal strategies. They were completely out of their depth. It was Running Deer who suggested that they needed help. She said that if Whitmore was fighting with weapons they did not understand, they needed to find someone who could teach them. She said there must be people in the territory who knew about the law, people who might be willing to help them for reasons that went beyond money. Samuel remembered something Lieutenant Morrison had mentioned during one of his visits. There was a man in Tucson, a former judge named Harold Whitfield, who had retired from the bench and now spent his time advocating for fair treatment of the territory's native peoples. Morrison had described him as a good man, honest and principled, someone who genuinely believed in justice rather than just paying it lip service. The next morning, Samuel rode for Tucson. The journey took 3 days, and during that time Samuel had plenty of opportunity to think about his situation. He was a simple man, had never been one for deep reflection or complex plans. He dealt with problems directly, usually with his hands or his gun. This kind of abstract conflict, fought with words and documents rather than physical force, was foreign to his nature. But as he rode through the beautiful Arizona landscape, watching the sun rise and set over mountains that had stood unchanged for millions of years, he began to see things from a different perspective. The land did not care about lawsuits or legal technicalities. It did not recognize the authority of judges or the power of money. It simply was eternal and indifferent, offering its gifts to anyone strong enough to claim them. Running Deer was part of this land in a way that Whitmore could never be. Her people had lived here for thousands of years, had learned its secrets, and become one with its rhythms. No piece of paper, no ruling from any court, could change that fundamental truth. Whatever happened in the weeks and months to come, Running Deer would always belong to this place, and it would always belong to her. Tucson was a sprawling town, much larger than Silver Creek, with paved streets and brick buildings that spoke of ambitions toward civilization. Samuel felt out of place among the well-dressed citizens and busy merchants, but he kept his eyes on his goal and asked directions until he found the home of Harold Whitfield. The former judge lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a garden of desert plants that bloomed in bright colors despite the harsh conditions. He was a thin man in his 60s with a mane of white hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence. He welcomed Samuel into his home with genuine warmth and listened patiently as the rancher explained his situation. When Samuel finished speaking, Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. Then, he asked to see the legal documents that Sheriff Wilson had delivered. He read through them carefully, his expression growing more and more troubled as he turned the pages. He told Samuel that the lawsuit was a classic example of how wealthy men used the legal system to destroy those who could not afford to fight back. The claims were specious, unsupported by any legitimate evidence, and would almost certainly be dismissed if they ever reached a fair trial. But that was not the point. The point was to bury Samuel and Running Deer under an avalanche of legal procedures, to drain their resources and their energy until they had nothing left to fight with. He also said something more disturbing. He said that there were judges in the territory who could be bought, men who would rule. However, Whitmore wanted them to rule in exchange for sufficient payment. If the case went before one of these corrupt officials, Samuel and Running Deer could lose everything regardless of the merits of their position. Samuel asked if there was anything that could be done. He said he was not a rich man, that he could not match Whitmore's wealth, but he was willing to do whatever it took to protect his wife and his home. Whitfield studied him for a long moment, as if measuring his character against some internal standard. Then, he smiled and said that he had been hoping Samuel would say something like that. He explained that he had spent the years since his retirement building a network of people who shared his commitment to justice. Lawyers who worked for free on behalf of those who could not afford representation. Journalists who were willing to expose corruption and abuse. Politicians who believed that the law should serve all citizens equally. These people had helped many others in situations similar to Samuel's, and Whitfield believed they could help him too. But he warned that it would not be easy. Whitmore's lawyers were skilled and relentless, and they had unlimited resources at their disposal. The fight would be long and difficult, with many setbacks along the way. Samuel would need patience and determination, qualities that did not come naturally to a man of action. Samuel told him that he had both. He said that his wife had taught him that there were many different kinds of strength, and that the ability to endure hardship was sometimes more important than the ability to strike hard. He said he would do whatever was necessary, for however long it took. Whitfield nodded with satisfaction. He said he would begin working on the case immediately, reaching out to his contacts and developing a strategy for the legal battle ahead. He said Samuel should return home and continue his normal life as much as possible, showing Whitmore that his tactics were not having the intended effect. He also gave Samuel some advice that would prove valuable in the difficult months to come. He said that the most important thing was to maintain the support of the community. Whitmore's strategy depended on isolating Samuel and Running Deer, turning their neighbors against them, and making them feel alone and vulnerable. If they could counter this by building relationships and demonstrating their value to the community, they would undermine the entire foundation of Whitmore's attack. Samuel thanked the old judge and rode home with a lighter heart than he had felt in weeks. He was still facing a dangerous enemy with vast resources, but he was no longer alone. He had allies now, people who understood the system he was fighting against and knew how to use it to his advantage. When he told Running Deer about his meeting with Whitfield, she listened with her characteristic calm. When he finished, she nodded once and said that this was good. She said that she had always known they would need more than just physical strength to survive in this world, and that finding people who would fight alongside them was the most important victory they could achieve. The legal battle that followed was unlike anything Samuel had ever experienced. There were hearings and depositions, motions and countermotions, delays and continuances that seemed designed to stretch the proceedings out indefinitely. Whitmore's lawyers were everywhere, objecting to everything, demanding documents and testimony that took weeks to gather and prepare. But Whitfield and his network proved equal to the challenge. They matched every legal maneuver with one of their own, countered every argument with compelling evidence, and slowly began to turn the tide in Samuel's favor. Witnesses came forward to testify about what they had seen on the day of the fight, contradicting the claims in Whitmore's lawsuit. Other witnesses told stories of Whitmore's past behavior, establishing a pattern of predatory conduct that undermined his credibility. Perhaps most importantly, Whitfield managed to get the case transferred to a judge who could not be bought. Judge Thomas Bradley was a stern man with a reputation for absolute integrity, a jurist who had sent more than one corrupt official to prison, and who had no tolerance for wealthy men who thought their money put them above the law. When Whitmore's lawyers realized who they would be facing, their confidence visibly wavered. Throughout these months of legal warfare, Samuel and Running Deer continued to build their support in the community. They helped neighbors with difficult tasks, shared their knowledge of farming and animal husbandry, and made themselves available whenever anyone needed assistance. Running Deer taught some of the local women about the medicinal properties of desert plants, knowledge that had been passed down through her people for generations. Samuel helped organize a volunteer fire brigade after a barn fire threatened to spread through the town. These efforts paid dividends in ways that were not immediately obvious. People who might have been tempted by Whitmore's money found themselves reluctant to testify against neighbors who had helped them in times of need. The narrative that Whitmore's lawyers were trying to construct of Samuel and Running Deer as dangerous outsiders who threatened the community simply did not match the reality that people experienced every day. The turning point came in early spring, nearly a year after Whitmore had first ridden onto Samuel's ranch. Judge Bradley finally ruled on the various motions and counter-motions that had accumulated during the proceedings, and his decision was devastating to Whitmore's case. The judge found that there was no credible evidence to support the charges against Running Deer, and he dismissed the attempted murder case entirely. He also found that Whitmore's civil lawsuit was motivated by malice rather than genuine grievance, and he imposed substantial penalties on Whitmore's lawyers for wasting the court's time with frivolous claims. But the most damaging part of the ruling was yet to come. Judge Bradley had reviewed the evidence gathered by Whitfield's network, evidence that showed a pattern of similar behavior by Whitmore in other states. He referred this evidence to federal authorities and recommended that Whitmore himself be investigated for various crimes, including extortion, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. When word of the ruling reached Silver Creek, the celebration was immediate and overwhelming. People who had kept their distance from Samuel and Running Deer now openly embraced them, acknowledging what they had always known but been afraid to say. The couple who had once been outcasts were now heroes, symbols of the possibility that justice could prevail even against the most powerful enemies. But Samuel knew better than to let his guard down completely. Whitmore had lost this battle, but he was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. The legal proceedings had wounded him badly, both financially and reputationally, but they had not destroyed him. He still had resources, still had connections, still had the burning desire for revenge that had driven him from the beginning. The next attack, when it came, would be different. It would not come through lawyers and courtrooms. It would come in some other form, something that Samuel could not predict or prepare for. All he could do was wait and watch and keep himself ready for whatever was coming. The war was not over. It had merely entered a new phase. Running Deer sensed his unease, as she always did. On the night after the ruling was announced, as they sat together on their porch and watched the stars appear one by one in the vast Arizona sky, she told him something that helped him find peace. She said that her people had a teaching about enemies. They believed that an enemy who pursued you with such determination was actually giving you a gift. The gift was the opportunity to discover your own strength, to learn what you were truly capable of, to become the person you were meant to be. She said that Whitmore had given them this gift, though he had not intended to. He had tested them in ways they could never have imagined, and they had emerged stronger than before. They had discovered allies they would never have found otherwise. They had earned respect they would never have sought. They had built a life together that was richer and more meaningful than it could ever have been without the struggle. Samuel listened to her words and felt something shift inside him. The fear that had been his constant companion for so many months began to fade, replaced by something that felt almost like gratitude. Not gratitude for Whitmore himself, but gratitude for the journey they had taken, for the people they had become, for the love that had carried them through. Whatever came next, they would face it together. That was all that mattered. But the storm that was coming would test even their remarkable bond in ways they could not possibly imagine. Frederick Whitmore had not given up. He was merely gathering his strength for one final, devastating assault. The summer of 1888 brought a heat that seemed to rise from the very earth itself, baking the Arizona landscape until even the hardiest plants wilted under the relentless sun. Samuel worked longer hours than ever before, trying to keep his cattle watered and his crops alive despite conditions that seemed determined to destroy everything he had built. Running Deer worked alongside him as she always did, her strength and endurance making it possible to accomplish tasks that would have broken lesser people. Despite the hardship, there was a contentment to their days that had been missing during the dark months of legal battle. The threat of Whitmore seemed distant now, a memory of troubles past rather than a present danger. Word had reached them that the wealthy man had returned to Boston to deal with the federal investigation that Judge Bradley had initiated. His reputation was in ruins, his business interests were suffering, and he had more pressing concerns than revenge against a small rancher in Arizona. At least, that was what everyone believed. The first indication that something was wrong came on a scorching afternoon in late July. Samuel was working in the north pasture, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a wandering bull, when he saw a column of dust rising on the road that led from town. It was moving fast, faster than a casual traveler would move in such heat, and something about it made his instincts tingle with unease. He left his work and rode toward the approaching dust cloud, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. As he got closer, he recognized the rider as young Tom Mueller, Heinrich's son, a boy of about 16 who worked as a messenger and delivery runner for his father's store. Tom was riding as if demons were chasing him, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. When he saw Samuel, he pulled up short and gasped out his message in a breathless rush. Armed men had arrived in Silver Creek that morning. A lot of them, at least 20, maybe more. They were not making any trouble, not yet, but they had taken over the saloon and the hotel and were asking questions about Samuel and Running Deer. Tom's father had sent him to warn them as soon as he could get away without being noticed. Samuel felt the familiar cold knot form in his stomach. He had known this moment would come eventually. He had hoped for more time, but hoping had never changed reality. He thanked Tom and sent him back to town with instructions to tell his father what was happening and to spread the word to any friends who might be willing to help. Then, he rode for home as fast as his horse could carry him. Running Deer was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her rifle in her hands and her eyes fixed on the distant road. She had seen Tom's approach and departure, and she had guessed what it meant. When Samuel told her the details, she nodded once and began preparations for what they both knew was coming. They worked quickly and efficiently, packing supplies and weapons, saddling the horses they had kept ready for just this emergency, making sure everything was in place for a rapid departure. The plan they had made so many months ago, the retreat to the hidden canyon in the mountains, was now their only hope of survival. But even as they worked, Samuel could not shake the feeling that something was different this time. The last attack had been impulsive, driven by the immediate aftermath of Whitmore's humiliation. This attack had been planned for months, prepared with the resources and patience of a man who had learned from his mistakes. Whatever was coming would not be a simple repetition of what had happened before. The sun was beginning to set when they finally spotted the riders approaching. There were more of them than Samuel had expected, perhaps 30 men spread out in a wide line that cut off any escape toward the east or south. They moved with military precision, coordinating their approach through signals that were invisible to untrained eyes. At their head rode a figure that Samuel did not recognize, a tall man with a scarred face and cold, professional eyes. This was not Whitmore himself, but someone he had hired, someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had no personal stake in the outcome beyond the money he had been promised. Samuel and Running Deer mounted their horses and rode west, toward the mountains that had always been their refuge. The riders behind them immediately broke into pursuit, but they did not seem to be in a hurry. They knew where their quarry was going, and they were confident that there was no escape. The chase went on for hours, through the gathering darkness and into the moonlit night. Samuel and Running Deer knew this land intimately, every hill and valley, every hidden path and secret crossing. They used this knowledge to stay ahead of their pursuers, sometimes gaining distance and sometimes losing it, always moving toward the mountains that promised safety. But the men behind them were skilled and relentless. Every time Samuel thought they had gained some breathing room, the riders would appear again, closer than before. They were being herded, he realized, pushed in a specific direction by an enemy who knew exactly what they were doing. It was almost dawn when they reached the entrance to the canyon that Running Deer had told him about so long ago. It was hidden behind a screen of rocks and brush, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly where to look. They dismounted and led their horses through the narrow passage, emerging into a bowl-shaped valley with steep walls on all sides. But something was wrong. Samuel could feel it in his bones, a sense of wrongness that made his skin crawl with premonition. He looked around the canyon, searching for the source of his unease, and then he saw it. Men, dozens of them, positioned on the walls of the canyon, their rifles trained on the valley floor below. They had been waiting here, had known exactly where Samuel and Running Deer would run, had set up this ambush with the patience and precision of hunters who knew their prey. And standing in the center of the valley, his arms folded across his chest, and a smile of triumph on his battered face, was Frederick Whitmore. Samuel's hand moved toward his pistol, but a voice from behind stopped him cold. He turned to see that the riders who had been pursuing them had entered the canyon as well, blocking the only exit. They were completely surrounded, trapped in the very refuge they had counted on for survival. Whitmore walked toward them with the slow, satisfied pace of a man who had finally achieved something he had been working toward for a very long time. His face still bore the marks of Running Deer's fists, scars, and misalignments that would never fully heal. But his eyes were bright with vindication, and his voice was strong as he addressed them. He said he had learned from his mistakes. He said he had spent the past year planning this moment, studying Samuel and Running Deer's habits, learning about their secret places and hidden plans. He said he had hired the best men money could buy and had given them all the time they needed to prepare. He said there was no escape this time, no cavalry coming to the rescue, no legal tricks that could save them. Running Deer stepped forward, her face calm despite the desperate situation. She asked Whitmore what he wanted, what he hoped to achieve by all this. She reminded him that he was already facing federal investigation, that whatever he did here would only make things worse for him. Whitmore laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. He said he no longer cared about investigations or consequences. He said that everything he had worked for was already lost, his reputation destroyed, his business in ruins, his social standing reduced to nothing. He said that all he had left was revenge, and he intended to have it. He said that Samuel was going to watch what happened to his wife. He said that Samuel was going to understand what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. And then, when it was over, they would both be killed and their bodies would disappear into the mountains, never to be found. Samuel felt a rage building inside him, a fury so intense that it threatened to overwhelm every rational thought. He wanted to charge at Whitmore, to tear the man apart with his bare hands regardless of the consequences. But he knew that would only make things worse, would give the hired guns an excuse to open fire and end everything in a hail of bullets. Running Deer touched his arm, a gentle pressure that communicated more than words ever could. He looked at her and saw something in her eyes that he did not expect. It was not fear or despair. It was determination, and beneath that, something that looked almost like hope. She spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone in the canyon to hear. She said that Whitmore had made a mistake. She said that he had been so focused on them, so obsessed with his revenge, that he had failed to notice what was happening around him. Whitmore frowned, his confidence wavering slightly. He asked what she meant. Running Deer smiled, that fierce expression that Samuel loved so much. She said that the people of Silver Creek knew what was happening. She said that Tom Mueller had spread the word, and that help was already on the way. She said that Whitmore had brought 30 men, but there were more than 30 people in the territory who cared about what happened to Samuel and Running Deer Cole. As if in response to her words, a new sound reached their ears. It was distant, but growing louder, the rumble of many horses approaching from multiple directions. Whitmore's men on the canyon walls began to shift nervously, looking toward the sounds with obvious concern. Whitmore shouted for his men to hold their positions, to remain calm, and focus on the task at hand. But the sounds kept growing, and now they could see dust clouds rising on all sides of the mountains, converging on the canyon from every direction. The first riders to appear were from Silver Creek, Heinrich Mueller and his sons, Maria Vasquez, and her brothers, farmers and ranchers who had received Samuel's help over the past year and were now coming to return the favor. They were followed by others, people Samuel did not recognize, people who had heard the story of the giant Apache woman and her devoted husband and had decided that such people were worth fighting for. And then, to everyone's astonishment, a column of cavalry appeared on the eastern ridge, their blue uniforms gleaming in the morning light. At their head rode Lieutenant James Morrison, who had never forgotten the promise he had made to Samuel more than a year before. The hired guns looked at Whitmore for guidance, but the wealthy man was staring at the approaching forces with an expression of utter disbelief. He had planned everything so carefully, had accounted for every variable, had believed that his money and his patience would finally give him what he wanted. And now, at the moment of his triumph, it was all falling apart. One of the hired guns, the scarred man who had led the pursuit, made a decision. He called out to his men, telling them that the job was over, that no amount of money was worth dying for a fight they could not win. He threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. The others followed his example, one by one dropping their weapons and stepping away from their positions. Within minutes, the carefully constructed ambush had dissolved into a group of defeated men waiting to learn their fate. Whitmore was the last to give up. He stood in the center of the canyon, surrounded by his surrendering men, staring at Samuel and Running Deer with an expression of pure hatred. He said that this was not over, that he would find another way, that they had not seen the last of him. But his words were empty threats, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Morrison rode forward and placed Whitmore under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and various other charges that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. The wealthy man from Boston was led away in chains, his dreams of revenge finally and permanently destroyed. The aftermath of that day was a celebration that lasted for weeks. The people who had come to help Samuel and Running Deer were welcomed as heroes, feted with meals and drinks and expressions of gratitude that came from the deepest part of the heart. The story of the siege in the canyon spread across the territory and beyond, becoming another chapter in the legend that had begun with the fight in Silver Creek. Judge Harold Whitfield traveled from Tucson to personally congratulate Samuel and Running Deer on their survival. He told them that Whitmore's arrest had broken open a network of corruption that reached far beyond Arizona, implicating officials and businessmen in several states. The investigation would continue for years, but the outcome was not in doubt. Frederick Whitmore would never threaten anyone again. Lieutenant Morrison was promoted to captain for his role in the rescue. He visited the ranch one last time before leaving for his new assignment, and he told Samuel and Running Deer that knowing them had changed his understanding of what it meant to be brave. He said that he had seen soldiers face death in battle, but he had never seen anyone face the kind of sustained persecution they had endured with such grace and determination. He said they had taught him something important about the human spirit, and he would carry that lesson with him for the rest of his life. As for Samuel and Running Deer themselves, they returned to the life they had built together on their small ranch outside Silver Creek. The years that followed brought many changes to the Arizona territory, changes that sometimes improved the lives of people like them, and sometimes made things harder. But through it all, they remained together, working their land and raising the children that eventually came to bless their union. Running Deer never forgot her people, the Apache who had been scattered and defeated by the relentless advance of white settlement. She taught her children the language and traditions of their heritage, making sure that something of her culture would survive into future generations. She also became a bridge between the remaining Apache and the settlers, using her unique position to foster understanding and reduce conflict wherever she could. Samuel grew old on the land he had claimed as a young man, watching his children and grandchildren take over the work of running the ranch. He never lost the humble, hard-working nature that had defined him from the beginning, but he also never forgot the lessons he had learned during the years of struggle. He taught his sons that true strength was not about fighting, but about standing up for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. He taught his daughters that their worth was not determined by what others thought of them, but by the courage and integrity they showed in the face of adversity. Running Deer lived to see the 20th century, a remarkable achievement for a woman who had once been left to die beside a creek in the Arizona wilderness. In her final years, she was recognized as an elder of great wisdom, sought out by people from all walks of life who wanted to learn from her experiences. She told her story to anyone who would listen, not to glorify herself, but to remind people that love and courage could overcome even the most powerful enemies. When she finally passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, the whole territory mourned her loss. She was buried on the hillside overlooking the ranch, next to the grave of old Esteban Morales, who had sold the land to Samuel so many years before. Samuel joined her there a few years later, and their tombstones stood side by side, a testament to a love that had defied every attempt to destroy it. The story of Samuel Cole and his giant Apache wife became part of the folklore of the American West, told and retold around campfires and in saloons for generations to come. Some versions exaggerated the details beyond recognition, turning the couple into superhuman figures of myth and legend. But others kept closer to the truth, recognizing that the real story was remarkable enough without embellishment. What made their story endure was not the violence or the drama, though there was plenty of both. It was the simple, powerful truth at its heart, that love could flourish in the most unlikely circumstances, that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together, and that the human spirit was capable of overcoming any obstacle that the world put in its path. Frederick Whitmore had offered $10,000 for a single night with Samuel's wife. He had believed that everything had a price, that his wealth gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from the world. He had been wrong. Some things could not be bought. Some things could not be taken by force. Some things could only be earned through courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Samuel Cole had slowly reached for his gun that day when Whitmore made his obscene offer. But, in the end, it was not his gun that saved them. It was his love, and Running Deer's strength, and the community they had built around them through years of honest work and genuine care for their neighbors. That was the lesson that the story taught to all who heard it. That was the truth that made it worth remembering across the decades and centuries that followed. And that was how a small rancher and his remarkable wife became legends of the American frontier, their names spoken with reverence long after the world they had known had faded into history. The end.